welcome back to The Explainer. Today, we are diving straight into one of the most incredible, wild, historical roller coasters of the entire 20th century, the Great Depression. In this Explainer, we're going to break down exactly how a booming, roaring nation suddenly found itself literally starving in the dust, and then how it painstakingly rebuilt itself from the ground up.
Okay, let's dive into this. Woke up rich, went to bed broke. It sounds like a total exaggeration, right? But honestly, it wasn't. There was no war. There was no real warning. Just a terrifying crash that sent the American dream spiraling into a decade of hunger and dust. To really understand how everything fell apart so fast, we have to rewind to the massive party that happened just before the fall.
So imagine you're waking up in 1922. World War I is in the rearview mirror, and the economy, it is absolutely vibing. Factories that were churning out tanks suddenly pivoted to making toasters, vacuum cleaners, and fancy new refrigerators. The American economy wasn't just growing, it was completely revving. Thanks to Henry Ford's moving assembly line, building a Model T went from taking 12 grueling hours to just 90 minutes. New York's skyline was shooting up overnight, and jazz music, well, jazz became the Wi-Fi of the 1920s. It was loud, it was everywhere, and even if nobody fully understood how it worked, everyone absolutely loved it.
Between 1922 and 1929, this economic party accelerated at a breakneck pace. By 29, 10 million homes had radios. They were broadcasting everything from soap operas to Al Jolson. But, and this is absolutely crucial to remember, not everyone was out on the dance floor. While the cities partied, rural farmers who made a fortune during wartime were facing plummeting crop prices. They were borrowing money to buy shiny new tractors, which unfortunately just helped them go broke slightly faster. Meanwhile, city folks discovered the absolute magic of buy now, pay later. Installment plans were practically being handed out to anyone with a pulse.
Now, the real mechanism that fueled this ultimate mania came straight from Wall Street. It was called the margin loan. Basically, it allowed anyone to buy $100 worth of stock with just $10 down. The remaining $90, fully borrowed. This was, without a doubt, the loaded gun of the 1920s. Stocks were seen as completely defying gravity. Fundamentals? They didn't matter. It was all just based on vibes. It got to the point where shoeshine boys were pitching investments to bankers, and barbers and bellboys were giving hot stock tips to the ultra-rich, all gambling on borrowed money.
But, there were definitely cracks forming underneath all that champagne and jazz. A few people actually tried to sound the alarm. Economist Roger Babson issued this incredibly stark warning in 1929. He just said, "A crash is coming." So how exactly did Wall Street respond to this? Well, they bought more stock. They essentially told Roger to go take a hike, and they turned up the jazz music to drown out his warnings while dollar bills seemingly rained from the sky. Nobody wanted to pause and check if the floorboards could actually hold the weight of all this mounting consumer and rural debt.
And then the music just stopped. October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. The day the stock market didn't just fall, it performed a flawless 10-meter dive straight into solid concrete. The sheer panic was unimaginable. Ticker tapes started spitting out red numbers like they were completely possessed. Phones were ringing nonstop on the trading floor, suits were literally screaming in terror, and some traders actually fainted right then and there. The Roaring Twenties face-planted into a brick wall.
When you adjust the numbers for inflation, over $200 billion of wealth vanished. Poof, gone. And the really important point here is that this wasn't monopoly money. We're talking about real homes, real college funds, real life savings, and real dreams just vanishing instantly. Outside the stock exchange, these stunned crowds gathered in total silence, just trying to process how the entire U.S. economy had tripped over its own shoelaces.
So, you might be asking yourself, how does one bad day on Wall Street ruin the entire world? Well, it triggers a deadly chain reaction. Step 1, margin calls. Brokers demanded that missing $90 back immediately. Step 2, investor bankruptcy. People scrambled, but they had absolutely nothing left to repay, so those paper fortunes evaporated. Step 3, bank collapses. Since banks were built on worthless paper and pure optimism, when they couldn't get their loans back, they completely collapsed. This sparked massive bank runs where desperate crowds literally banged on locked doors just trying to get their savings, which leads us to Step 4.
The disaster definitely did not stop at America's shores. Panicking U.S. banks suddenly called in their overseas loans, and this brilliantly illustrates how throwing fragile European economies, which, keep in mind, were still basically duct taped together after World War I, straight into a blender, changed everything. Germany's recovery completely collapsed. Britain wobbled. Global trade, the great artery of global prosperity, choked and fell by exactly half in just 3 years.
Now, despite politicians constantly trying to deliver sunny headlines, claiming the economy was, quote, fundamentally sound, the reality on the ground was drastically different. By 1931, the lights were off. The party was absolutely over. And what came next wasn't just silence. It was the heavy, grinding sound of factories coming to a dead halt. Detroit, which was the industrial crown jewel of America, watched its mighty auto plants shudder as production collapsed by an astonishing 75%. The great machines stopped turning. The men who once assembled the American dream were just left standing outside locked factory gates, waiting for an answer that simply wasn't coming.
25%. Literally 1 in every 4 Americans who wanted to work couldn't find a job. And this single number hides millions of deeply personal, deeply human tragedies. Entire cities sagged under the weight of endless, quiet breadlines. Desperation crept into every single room. Teachers were reporting students actually fainting in class, not from boredom, but from literal hunger, having not eaten in days. The suicide rate surged so high that some local newspapers had to stop printing obituaries because they just couldn't keep up. Marriage rates collapsed, birth rates fell. The future became something people just avoided talking about altogether.
Over in Washington, President Herbert Hoover tried to hold the center. He largely encouraged volunteerism and launched big projects like the Hoover Dam, but he refused large-scale federal aid, calling it dangerous. As a result, his name became a bleak new vocabulary for everyday suffering. Hoovervilles were the makeshift shantytowns constructed entirely out of scrap and cardboard. Hoover blankets were the daily newspapers destitute citizens used just to stay warm at night. And Hoover flags? Well, those are just empty pockets pulled inside out.
And just when it seemed like things couldn't possibly get any worse, the environment itself turned against the country. Decades of incredibly aggressive farming had completely stripped the Great Plains bare. When the rains stopped, towering black blizzards of dust buried crops and literally suffocated livestock. Millions of people packed up and fled west, in broken-down cars chasing faint rumors of jobs out in California. Back east, the despair bred intense conflict. In the summer of '32, the bonus army of desperate World War I veterans marched on Washington, demanding their promised service bonuses. And how were they greeted? They were met with tear gas and burned camps from their own government. Radicalism spread like wildfire, and bank robbers like John Dillinger were suddenly being viewed as folk heroes, striking back at the very institutions that had betrayed the public. America wasn't just broke, it was profoundly broken.
But miraculously, the country's endurance held, and a pivotal turning point finally arrived. By March 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt stepped up to the inauguration podium and delivered this legendary line: "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." He looked out at the nation and told them that they didn't need to fear gold or the banks or the dust anymore. It was so much more than just a political speech. It really represented the very first deep breath the country had been able to take in years.
And Roosevelt didn't just talk. He immediately launched what famously became known as the alphabet soup of recovery programs. It was a complete flurry of action. He built rules like the SEC to regulate Wall Street and the FDIC to protect your deposited bank money, which, by the way, is exactly why your cash is still safe in your checking account today. Then came the labor. The CCC put young men to work planting millions of trees and saving the land. The WPA hired millions more to build roads, bridges, and schools, putting shovels directly into hands and pride right back into hearts. The TVA brought dams, electricity, and literal light to towns that had lived in complete darkness. The American machine was finally being fixed, not just oiled.
So, the real takeaway here is that slowly but surely life actually began to stir again. GDP rose, unemployment finally crept downward, Social Security was born, providing a monumental safety net that essentially told everyday citizens, hey, you matter. Even the arts played a huge role in piecing the nation's shattered identity back together. The government literally paid photographers like Dorothea Lange to go out and capture the raw, enduring soul of the recovering country. Over in Hollywood, audiences packed into theaters to watch The Wizard of Oz, marveling as a gray, depressing world literally turned to vibrant, beautiful color right there on screen. Cities buzzed again, restaurants reopened, and the American skyline looked like it was finally rising once more.
Now, the Great Depression didn't just end with some massive ticker-tape celebration. It ended with blistered hands, completely new legislation, and a resilient nation choosing piece by piece to rise again. But look really closely at what happened next. The factories are definitely humming again, yes, but this time around, they aren't making toasters and radios. They are churning out combat helmets, combat boots, and ammunition. America was finally standing back up, but what darker, louder global storm was already brewing on the horizon? Well, that is a question for our next explainer. Thank you so much for diving into this with me, and as always, stay curious.